My son called to tell me the locks had been changed. Not my wife, my son. He'd driven over to drop off the medication I'd left at his house after Thanksgiving, and when he punched in the gate code at the end of the driveway, the keypad blinked red. He tried twice, then called me. I was still sitting in the hospital discharge lounge, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, the cardiologist's follow-up instructions folded in my jacket pocket. The cardiac catheterization had gone smoothly, they said. No stenting required. Routine monitoring. Go home and rest. I thanked my son and told him not to worry. I hung up and sat with that information for a moment, the way you sit with a sound you can't quite identify, turning it slowly, examining each side. My wife had changed the gate code. She had done it while I was still in recovery, while the sedation was wearing off, while I was asking a nurse whether I could have another blanket because the room was cold. I didn't call her. I already knew she wouldn't answer. Outside, the December sky over Houston was the color of pewter. The cab I'd called was still 4 minutes away, according to my phone. I finished the coffee, set the cup down on the plastic chair beside me, and thought about the conversation I'd had with my accountant 6 weeks earlier. At the time, it had felt like an abundance of caution. Now it felt like providence. My name is Richard Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, mostly infrastructure, bridges and drainage systems, the kind of work that teaches you to calculate load-bearing capacity before you ever pour a single yard of concrete. I retired at 59 when my firm was acquired, and the terms were generous enough that I had no reason to stay. My wife had seemed pleased. More time together, she said. We could finally travel. We did travel for about a year. Then the travel stopped, and she found other things to do, and I found other things to do, and the house grew quietly around us like a structure neither of us had designed. The cab arrived. I gave the driver the address and watched the city slide past the window. She had married me 22 years ago, a second marriage for both of us. She was 41 and precise, and beautiful in the way of women who have survived something and come out on the other side with a particular kind of stillness. I had loved her methodically, the way I loved most things, with attention and patience and a belief that careful maintenance prevents catastrophic failure. I was wrong about that, it turns out. Some failures are designed from the inside. When the cab pulled up to the gate, I punched in the old code out of habit. Red light. I tried her birthday. Red light. I sat in the back seat for a moment, then asked the driver to wait and walked around the property line to the side entrance near the garden shed. It had a manual key lock. I still had that key on my ring, because I am the kind of man who keeps keys. The house was quiet when I entered. The kitchen was clean. A single glass sat on the counter, rinsed and upside down on a drying mat. Her car was gone. I walked through each room slowly, the way you walk through a building you're inspecting for damage, looking at the bones, not the surfaces. Her closet was half empty, not hastily emptied, selectively. The good things were gone. The rest remained, which told me she had time to plan this, and she had used that time carefully. On the kitchen island, under the clay bowl where we kept mail, I found a document. It was a real estate listing agreement, signed, dated 2 days earlier, for the lake house in the hill country. The property I'd owned for 16 years, long before I met her. The listing price was $420,000, which was $90,000 below market, which meant someone wanted it gone fast. I read the broker's name twice. Marcus Webb, her brother. I stood there with the listing agreement in my hand and understood, all at once, the complete geometry of it. I set the paper back exactly where I'd found it. I walked to my study, sat down at my desk, and called Patricia Holt. Patricia has been my attorney since 2009. She is 52, methodical, and constitutionally incapable of panic. When she answered and I told her what I'd found, she was quiet for 4 seconds. I know because I counted, and then she said, "Bring me everything you have and be here by 9 tomorrow morning." I slept in the guest room that night. I slept well, which surprised me. But stress had never produced insomnia in me. It produced clarity. My phone showed 6 missed calls by midnight. I did not listen to the voicemails. Patricia's office is in Midtown, 12 floors up with a view of the 610 loop that looks abstract and purposeful, depending on the light. She had coffee ready when I arrived at 8:47. She did not offer pleasantries. I laid out what I knew: the listing agreement, the changed gate code, the half-empty closet, the timing executed while I was sedated in a cardiology suite at Methodist Hospital. Patricia listened without interrupting, then said, "Walk me through the lake house ownership structure." I had purchased the Hill Country property in 2007 before the marriage and titled it under Callaway Land Holdings, LLC, a single-member entity I'd established for asset protection purposes. Standard practice for someone in my industry, where liability exposure from prior projects can trail you for decades. When we married, my wife knew about the property. She had never asked about the ownership structure, and I had never volunteered it. Not because I was hiding it, but because she had no interest in paperwork. Patricia nodded. "She cannot transfer what the LLC owns," she said. "The listing agreement is meaningless without the managing member's signature on the deed." "I know, but she doesn't know she doesn't know." That's an expensive assumption on her part. I leaned forward. "Patricia, check Marcus Webb's business filings." She turned to her monitor. I watched her expression as she scrolled. It shifted in a way I recognized from years of watching engineers review structural calculations, a slight tightening around the eyes. That means the numbers don't support the design. "He has 3 LLCs, she said. "One dissolved last year. One has 2 pending judgments. The third," she paused, "has a maturity default on a commercial note. 8 months overdue." "How much?" She turned the screen toward me. $440,000. I sat back in my chair. The lake house listing price was $420,000, $20,000 short of his debt. He would have taken a loss to get liquid, which meant the lender was close to enforcement action, which meant my wife had been watching her brother drown and had reached for the nearest rope. "Pull the healthcare proxy I signed before the procedure," I said. Patricia already had it on the screen. A standard document authorizing medical decisions in the event of incapacity. Nothing more. "She filed the listing agreement as managing member of the LLC," I said. Patricia pulled up the county recorder's portal. She exhaled once through her nose. "Yesterday at 2:17 p.m., a deed transfer request, signed under authority of healthcare proxy." "A healthcare proxy doesn't grant authority over business entities," I said. "No," Patricia said quietly. "It does not." My phone buzzed on the corner of her desk. "My wife." I turned it face down. "There's more," I said. 6 weeks ago, I hired a CPA named Dale Huang. He's forensic. I noticed 3 wire transfers from our joint investment account I hadn't authorized. When I questioned my wife, she said they were HOA fees for her mother's condo. The amounts were wrong for HOA fees. $31,000 total. Patricia was already writing. "Dale's number," she said. "I'll call him this morning. One more thing." I reached into my jacket and removed a folded printout. 3 weeks ago, my wife drove us to dinner in her car. We had an argument about my retirement accounts. She wanted consolidation. I resisted, and she got a call from Marcus. She put it on the car speakers without thinking. I was watching the road. She forgot I was there. I heard 6 minutes of that conversation before she noticed and ended the call. What did they say? Enough. I pressed the button on Patricia's desk speaker and played the recording from my phone. Marcus's voice was confident, slightly too loud, the voice of someone used to being the smartest person in rooms he'd chosen carefully. She heard it all. The timeline, the proceeds allocation, the phrase he used, "Once the dust settles, she'll be liquid and you'll be clear, and he won't be in a position to do much about it." My wife laughed, a short, anxious laugh. But she laughed. Patricia stopped writing. She stared at the speaker. "I didn't discover the recording to use it," I said. "I made a note of it and began to prepare." "When did you acquire Marcus's debt?" 4 days ago, through a holding company. The original lender was a private equity group in Dallas, Motivated Sellers. I bought it at a discount. Patricia set down her pen. "So, as of this moment, Marcus Webb owes you $440,000, plus penalties. And he doesn't know." "No." "And she doesn't know he doesn't know." Patricia looked at me carefully. "Richard, I've worked with engineers before. You all design for the worst-case scenario." "That's correct." She picked her pen back up. "Here is what we do this morning." My phone showed 19 missed calls by 11 a.m. I listened to one message. Her voice was measured, but the edges were fraying, the way a cable sounds when a few strands have already separated. She said she had done this for both of them. She said they needed a fresh start. She said the lake house had always been more mine than ours, which was true, and she seemed to offer it as justification rather than evidence of the problem. She said she hoped I would understand. I deleted the message and called Dale Huang. Dale confirmed the 3 wire transfers had been routed to a personal account in Marcus's name, disguised in the transaction notes as professional consulting fees. There was also a pending beneficiary modification on my whole life insurance policy, submitted online, not yet processed, flagged by the insurer's compliance team, because the request contradicted an irrevocable beneficiary designation from 2018. The insurer had called the cell number on file. That number was my wife's, not mine. Patricia filed a notice of dispute with the Harris County Property Records Office at 10:41 a.m. She notified the title company, a firm in Austin handling the Hill Country closing, that the deed transfer was legally defective and contested. She dispatched certified letters to Marcus Webb and his attorney of record. She petitioned for a temporary protective order on joint financial accounts pending fraud review. At 1:17 p.m., the Austin Title Company called Patricia's office to inform us they had suspended the closing. My phone showed 29 missed calls. At 3 p.m., Marcus Webb's attorney called Patricia and suggested, very calmly, that this was a misunderstanding rooted in medical confusion following my procedure. Patricia replied, equally calmly, that the Henderson Asset Protection Trust precedent was instructive on POA scope, and she looked forward to testing that principle in Harris County Civil Court if necessary. The attorney went quiet for a moment and then said he would call back. He didn't call back. My wife arrived at Patricia's office at 4:45. I had expected her to be composed. She was not. She was wearing the gray blazer she wore when she was nervous, the one she said made her feel organized, and her lipstick was freshly applied in the way that indicates rehearsal rather than confidence. She closed the door behind her and looked at Patricia first, then at me. You froze the accounts, she said. Joint accounts. Temporarily. You had no right. I had specific right, Patricia said. Under Texas law, misuse of healthcare proxy to execute business transfers constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation. We filed this morning. My wife turned to me. This is about Marcus, she said. You're punishing me because of Marcus. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm protecting what's mine. The lake house is sitting empty. You haven't been there in 2 years. She paused, recalibrating. You could have just said no. You didn't have to do all of this. You didn't ask, I said. The air in the room thinned. She sat down without being invited. Patricia slid a legal pad across the table, but my wife didn't look at it. She looked at me with an expression I recognized. Not guilt, not sorrow, but the specific frustration of someone who believed they were smarter than the outcome they were currently inside. He needed the money, she said. I know. He's going to lose everything if that loan calls. I know. She looked up sharply. You know? Patricia opened a folder and placed the debt assignment on the table between us. My wife stared at it. She read it once, then again. The color left her face in a slow, even recession, like water withdrawing from a shoreline. You bought it, she said. Her voice had gone very flat. Yes. When? 4 days ago. She pressed both palms against the table. Before I filed the deed. The day before. So the closing would have she stopped. The sale proceeds would have retired a debt I owned, I said. Yes. She was silent for a long time. Outside, a siren passed somewhere on the loop and faded. I didn't know you could do that, she said finally. That's not a defense. Her jaw tightened. She looked away toward the window. I waited. The cardiologist told me the procedure was routine, she said. I know. He also told me, in August, that your long-term vascular prognosis was, she paused. Uncertain. I know what he told you. She looked back at me. You were there? I was on the phone in the hallway when he reviewed the imaging with you. I heard everything. Her expression shifted into something I hadn't seen before on her face. Something almost like relief at being seen, followed immediately by the harder feeling of being caught. I was scared, she said. I understand that. You don't look like you understand it. I understand it, I said. I don't accept it as an explanation for what you did. She looked at Patricia. What does he want? Patricia spread the terms sheet across the table. Full disclosure of the wire transfers. Restoration of all account access. Written retraction of the listing agreement. Cooperation in dissolving the LLC authority claim with the county. An uncontested dissolution of the marriage. My wife closed her eyes briefly. The word dissolution was not a surprise to her, which meant she had already moved through this possibility in her own mind and made her peace with it, or told herself she had. And Marcus? She asked. Marcus honors his debt, I said. That's between him and me. He'll lose the River Oaks project. He over-leveraged a project without adequate pre-sales. That consequence belongs to him. She opened her eyes. She looked at the terms. She looked at the recording notation at the bottom of the page, a single line referencing the car. Bluetooth conversation, 3 weeks prior, 6 minutes. Transcript attached. You could have confronted me then, she said softly. Yes. Why didn't you? Because I wanted to understand the full structure before I responded to any part of it. Her voice fell. You were always like that. It's how I'm built. She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady, I noticed. Whatever fear she had carried into the room, she carried it quietly. I will give her that. She signed. The civil hearing was scheduled on a gray Thursday in January at the Harris County Civil Courthouse on Congress Avenue. The building is old and efficient, high ceilings, worn marble floors, the smell of recycled air and processed paperwork. It does not encourage drama, it encourages resolution. Patricia and I arrived at 8:40. Marcus Webb arrived at 8:50 with his attorney, a tall man in a suit that cost more than the outcome he was about to experience. Marcus had aged in the 4 weeks since the failed closing. He was still dressed well, men like Marcus always are, right up until they aren't, but his jaw was set in the particular way of a man running calculations he already knows come out negative. My wife sat across the aisle with her own attorney, a woman named Galvan, who had a reputation for clean, efficient divorce litigation. Neither of us had an interest in prolonging this. Judge Simmons entered at 9:02. She was in her early 60s, gray-haired, possessed of the unhurried precision of someone who has stopped being impressed by the scale of other people's miscalculations. She looked over the filings without rushing. Patricia presented first. The LLC structure, the healthcare proxy's legal scope, the deed transfer, the timing relative to my hospitalization, the forensic accountant's findings on the wire transfers, the debt acquisition, the car recording, not as a performance, as a construction document. This is what happened, in sequence, with supporting material for each step. Judge Simmons looked at Marcus's attorney. Counsel, does your client dispute the LLC's ownership of the Hill Country property? No, Your Honor. Does your client dispute that the healthcare proxy does not confer authority over LLC assets? A pause. We argue the intent was. The judge removed her reading glasses. Counsel, does your client dispute it? No, Your Honor. The deed transfer is void, the judge said. Property remains vested in Callaway Land Holdings, LLC. She made a notation. The wire transfers were characterized as consulting fees. I see. Mr. Webb, were services rendered? Marcus's attorney rose. Your Honor, the characterization. The judge looked at Marcus directly. Did you provide consulting services? Marcus swallowed. We had informal discussions about investment strategy for $31,000 across 3 transactions. Silence. The judge looked back at her papers. Financial exploitation under Texas Penal Code 32.53 is a second-degree felony when the victim is a disabled individual or is manipulated through a guardianship instrument. Mr. Callaway was recovering from a cardiac procedure. She looked at Patricia. Is your client pursuing criminal referral? Patricia glanced at me. Not at this time, I said. The civil resolution is sufficient. The judge nodded once. Mr. Webb, you have an outstanding commercial note, now held by a Callaway-affiliated entity, in default by 8 months. You are aware of this? Yes, Your Honor. The lender, Mr. Callaway, effectively has not accelerated the note. He is allowing the contractual timeline to perform. I would encourage you to honor your obligations accordingly and not test the generosity of that arrangement. Marcus sat down. Judge Simmons signed the protective order. The deed dispute notation was recorded. The civil protection on the joint accounts would remain pending the divorce finalization, set for February. Afterward, in the hallway, Marcus stepped toward me. His attorney put a hand on his arm, but Marcus shook it off. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then forgot it in the room. You didn't have to buy the note, he said. You didn't have to take my wife's money, I replied. He looked at me for a moment longer, then walked toward the elevator. My wife waited near the corridor window. Her attorney was speaking quietly to her, but she was watching me from across the distance. When Patricia and I passed, she held up a hand. Patricia kept walking. I stopped. I want to ask you something, she said. Honestly, go ahead. Did you ever trust me? Not with the money, she said quickly. With you? I considered the question seriously. Yes, I said. For a long time. When did it change? When it started costing you something to be honest with me and you chose dishonesty instead. I didn't know exactly when that began, but I recognize it when I see it. She nodded slowly. I was afraid of being left with nothing. You had the marriage, I said. You chose to treat it as insufficient. She looked at her hands. Travis Marcus, she corrected. He said you were. I know what he said about me. I heard him. She exhaled. I know. I said, you believed someone who needed your assistance over someone who had given you 22 years. She didn't answer, but she didn't argue. I walked to the elevator. The doors opened. Patricia stepped in first, and I followed. And I watched the hallway narrow in the closing gap until it was gone. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in February, on the kind of clear, cold morning Houston gets once or twice a year when the air actually feels sharp and clean, and the city looks like it was built by people who meant it. I drove to Patricia's office alone. I signed what needed signing. Patricia witnessed it. She shook my hand afterward with both of hers, which she had never done before, and said only, you were prepared. I said, I had good reasons to be. My son called that evening. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than all right, that the word for what I was feeling was probably simpler than anything clinical, something close to order restored. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who wants to ask something larger. I let him ask it. He said, did you know this was coming? I said, I knew something was. Not exactly what. I prepared for the shape of it. He said, that sounds lonely. I thought about that. It wasn't lonely, I said. It was clear. Those aren't the same thing. I moved in April, once the equity from the marital home was properly distributed, and I had signed a lease on a place in the Heights, a ground floor unit with tall ceilings and concrete floors, and a courtyard in the back where someone had planted Meyer lemon trees. I furnished it simply, a good desk, 2 chairs. The drafting table I'd kept in storage since I retired because I missed having a surface large enough to lay out a full plan and see it all at once. The Hill Country Lake House I kept. I drove down in early May, the first time I'd been there in almost 3 years. The road in had washed a little, the cedar had grown up on the east fence line, and the dock needed 2 planks replaced. I spent 4 days there alone. I fished in the morning and read in the afternoon and sat on the porch in the evenings while the sky did the things it does out there in the hill country. Going from pale gold to deep rust to something dark and absolute, with every star visible that you'd forgotten was there, I thought about 22 years. Not with grief I'd moved through already, quietly, in the months of preparation, when I understood what was happening and chose clarity over confrontation for as long as the preparation required. I thought about what it means to invest yourself in something and discover the foundation was different than you believed it to be. In engineering, you don't mourn the miscalculation. You document it. You redesign. You build what actually holds. In June, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Marcus. He had restructured the River Oaks project with a new capital partner and would be current on the note within 60 days. He said he understood if I chose to accelerate anyway. He said he was sorry for his role in what happened. I texted back one line, honor the note, nothing further is required. He replied, understood. I put the phone in my pocket and walked back out to the dock. There is something people get wrong about men like me. They assume that because we do not raise our voices, because we do not make scenes, because we measure twice before we act, they assume we are passive. They assume we are absorbing the blow because we cannot redirect it. They assume that silence means resignation. It doesn't. Silence, chosen deliberately, is the most accurate instrument I know. You hear things in silence that you cannot hear in noise. You see the structure. You identify the load-bearing elements and the decorative ones. You locate the failure point before it becomes the failure. My wife thought she had married a man in decline. She thought she could wait out my patience, my recovery, my careful and methodical way of moving through problems. She didn't understand that patience is not passivity. It is the longest preparation. If you've ever been dismissed, been managed, been underestimated by someone who calculated that you wouldn't look closely, I want you to hear this. Look closely, not with anger. Anger obscures the detail work. Look closely the way a good engineer looks at a joint, without sentiment, without assumption, with nothing but the willingness to see what is actually there. The foundation is yours. Know what's in it. Know who holds what. Know where the load-bearing walls are. And if someone tells you the property is theirs, check the deed. If this story found you where you needed it, if you've ever sat with a cold document in a quiet house and understood something you weren't ready for, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear that preparation is not paranoia, it's self-respect. I'll be here.